Welcome. Thank you for joining us today um, in this web.com webinar series. Today, we will be talking about mastering your small business brand voice. I'm B. Garza, social media specialist at web.com and your host. So this webinar will last about 30 to 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So feel free to add your questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen or leave us a comment. This webinar will also be recorded and available to watch anytime on Crowdcast and Web.com's YouTube channel after this is over. So today we have one of Web.com's best and brightest subject matter experts here to talk to you about mastering your small business brand voice. The goal of this webinar is to help you find and refine your brand voice, how to effectively communicate to your customers, and why your voice matters in establishing credibility in your niche. So I would like to introduce Lauren Robinson, senior copywriter at web.com and seasoned expert with over 15 years of experience in the internet marketing industry. Beyond her role at web.com, Lauren is an accomplished hobbyist, podcast host, and producer, having achieved niche success by combining her creative storytelling skills with her expertise in online engagement. She shares her passion for writing as a senior adjunct instructor at the University of North Florida, where she mentors aspiring writers and marketers. Now, without further ado, I will pass it over to Lauren to get into mastering your small business brand voice.
Oh, thank you so much, B. I'm so excited to be here to talk about all of this with everybody today. So to give you a little bit of background about my podcast in the first place, because I will refer back to how niche my market happens to be. My podcast is called the Beard Al Podcast, and the tagline is we talk about two of the greatest things in the world, beer and Weird Al. And so this podcast was kind of born out of bringing together two things that I really enjoy, just to basically see, hey, how do these worlds intersect and what happens? And I'll tell you what, understanding that there is absolutely a niche audience that appreciates both of those things as much as I do really opened my eyes and opened a lot of doors to what finding your voice means and what it means to connect that voice to your audience. So we start off with how do you connect with your customers, and let's get into what that means. And here's the thing, I'm coming at this from kind of two spaces for all of you here. I obviously work at web.com, and I'm one of the people that makes sure that web.com has a voice that you get to hear as somebody who sees our content online, right? But I'm also coming at this from my own personal space, saying like, what kind of audience does my podcast have, and what does my voice mean in that regard as well? So I do mentally a lot of switching voices depending on what role I happen to be in, and I feel like that gives me a unique perspective in understanding, well, what does voice mean when connecting with customers, right? So we start off with the art of creating messages that resonate. So like I said, I started my podcast almost 5 years ago. It was what I like to refer to as a pandemic baby, back in 2020, where we couldn't go out. We were kind of we missed that social interaction, that person to person kind of thing, right? So a lot of people were starting podcasts. There were podcasts popping up like gangbusters, right? So my voice was one small voice in a very large sea of people that were trying to be heard all at the same time. And so I just kind of began the show and said, well, let's see who listens. And it took a couple of months. It took a lot of like finding my footing to really understand what kind of message actually resonates with my audience, right? And I had a good hook, the craft beer and the Weird Al thing. People were like, huh, yeah, I can see how those two things overlap, because for those of you who don't know, Weird Al Yankovic is probably the greatest comedy musician that has ever existed, and I accept no arguments for that. But the craft beer space is also full of very funny and clever people. If you look at what craft breweries kind of name a lot of their offerings, they're funny, they're punny, and those worlds aren't super duper separate, right? It's the same sort of humor in both places. So that was my hook. But the hook wasn't necessarily enough. I had to start creating a voice for my brand out there that people could grab onto, that they could relate to beyond the hook, right? Because the hook in and of itself for my show is kind of esoteric, right? It's like, oh, this is like a very small niche, like 4 people probably like this. But that kind of came with making my brand visible and approachable in the digital age, because at the time that's all we had, again, early pandemic. And so I took a couple of pages out of, again, Weird Al's book, and I said, well, how does he engage with his audience? And it's with obviously a whole lot of humor, a little bit of self-deprecation, and a whole lot of, well, what do people want to hear from me? What do they expect? And so I took that humor, I took that, well, let's knock myself down a little bit if I kind of put out a clunker of an episode. I acknowledged that. And I just became this approachable voice that happened. And the next thing I knew, I was building this network of other podcasters who stopped just becoming like other voices in the podcast space and actually started becoming my friends that I would go to for collaboration or just ideas to help make my show better. So, yes, I became approachable to my audience, but I realized that my audience is a lot of different things. And so that kind of leads us into the next part of this, which is audience engagement and harnessing the power of connection. I'm going to start this section off with a little story. And actually, B, we talked through all of this before we started. I didn't share this story with you yet before. So the power of connection, and this isn't going to happen to everyone. But I put my podcast out there and I started engaging with my audience and engaging with other podcasters. And then this music podcast began engaging with my show. And I began engaging with the host of that podcast because it turns out, guess what? He's got a music podcast. He's a big fan of Weird Al Yankovic too. And to make a very long story short, because if any of you saw the some of the teaser videos that we put out for this webinar, one of it was how social media changed my life. Literally met my husband through podcast audience engagement. So, I'm not promising that will happen for everyone, but what I'm saying is if you're authentic and engage with your audience, good things absolutely can come your way. But to take it to a more tangible place for small businesses, the power of engaging with your audience. So it first comes as establishing yourself as an expert in your field. And that's going to mean something different for everyone. If, like me, you have an area of interest that you're creating a podcast about, right? I have a unique platform to be an expert in that thing that I know. But if you're a plumber or if you're a reseller or no matter what it is you're doing, if you're harnessing your online presence and social media to push your business forward, you have to find your way to be an expert. And ultimately that just kind of means, what's your hook? What is your what's the thing that makes you unique? What's the thing that you're the best at, that you do better than other people that are in that same room that are having conversations with you, right? So then how do you stand out as a thought leader in your niche? And here's part of what I think too many people forget is you're casting a huge net if you try and make everybody happy, right? If you try and reach everybody at once, you're ultimately going to reach no one. It's the jack of all trades, master of none kind of situation, right? So you need to figure out, well, what are you going to be the master at, and figure that out. And for me, it was engaging with my audience in an authentic, personal sort of way about this subject that we both kind of had in common. And this brings to mind some brands that also do this well. B, do you have any businesses that you think really are good at engaging with their audience online?
Yeah, definitely. I think brands, and I think back to brands that have been around for a long time. You know, we think of like Coca-Cola, we think of even like Kodak, that's been, early 1900s, late 1800s when that company started. You know, their slogan, I believe, was like press the button, we do the rest. Like they, had this really great product back then, and think of how it's evolved, over the years, and is still around today. Yeah, I think it's not only engaging with your audience, but also like adapting to what's relevant to your audience right now. And so, yeah, I think of those brands.
Oh, yeah. I mean, those are really good points. I like what you said about evolving too. Uh, one of the the best examples of a brand using evolving their audience engagement, and I am so susceptible to advertising that when this is over, I'm going to have to go get myself a latte. But Dunkin' Donuts, right? Back, everybody remembers Fred and Time to Make the Donuts, right? But they couldn't keep doing that. So Dunkin' Donuts kind of had to evolve how they were presenting their brand to the world. And a dozen or so years ago, so this is quite a while, when I was still finding my footing in the internet marketing space, um, I remember engaging with the Dunkin' Donuts brand account on Twitter, just trying to like figure out, see what they were doing to see what I could do to kind of help my clients get better, right? And I ended up having like a friendly online relationship with one of the faces behind the Dunkin' Donuts Twitter account, Java Josh. And Java Josh ended up calling me Latte Lauren and sent me a coffee mug in the mail. Apparently, he tried to get a name tag made for me, but you actually have to be a Dunkin' Donuts employee to have that. So he was like, sorry, I'll just send you a coffee mug instead. But what I'm getting at with that is like, during the Time to Make the Donuts time, there was no way to like connect with Dunkin' Donuts as a brand on a human to human level. And then fast forward to, the early 2010s, where like now I am, and I am brand loyal to Dunkin' Donuts simply because I had a personal connection with them at some point. And I just think that's really interesting. And to think about, how can you translate that to what you're doing, what your brand does, and finding your unique voice is part of that. One of the things that I tried really, really hard to do when I launched my podcast was to understand the conversations that were happening around my topic, around what my business is about. And part of that is understanding the room that you're in and reading the room, right? So understanding your audience and speaking their language. So for those of you who are familiar with the fine art of Weird Al Yankovic, you probably have in your mind's eye some picture of what the average Weird Al fan looks like. And shirt and glasses aside, it's probably not me, you know? Uh, People, think, nerdy guys are Weird Al fans. And once I started getting into that space and understanding, well, who am I even talking to with my podcast, I realized something pretty quickly, but I wasn't sure what to do with it from the jump. And that was, how do I, as a woman in this space, make my voice fit in this space, but also stand out in this space, right? Because the last thing I wanted to do was alienate any part of my audience by saying, well, I'm a woman, so my perspective is more valid than yours because yours is just like everybody else. Like, I can't do that, right? So I had to insert myself into conversations and get somebody to see something from my point of view without rocking the boat too much, right? Especially at the beginning, because I'm trying to build an audience for my brand here, right? So I needed to speak the language in the room. And part of that is balancing authenticity with professionalism. I would urge every single one of you, whatever your business happens to be true to you. I think, especially in this day and age, people are more likely to have loyalty to a brand if they feel like they have a personal connection with that brand. We're moving out of the monolithic, like, this is a big business and like I must trust them because they're a giant corporate entity kind of thing, and leaning more into I dig that vibe, and it resonates with me. This is how I want to do business. This is who I want to do business with. And that can mean a whole lot of things. I think one of the things that my husband and I like to do locally is try new restaurants. And I like to, especially after we go to this new restaurant, I like to try and find their socials and engage with them on that, just to let them know, like, hey, I really enjoyed my experience, with your food. And what's been really cool for me is to see the different spins that small local businesses put on their social presence. And some of it is very very in your face, all about the food. Some of it's a little more all about the people. Some of it is about the vibe in the restaurant itself. So it's like, I can tell the personality that is behind each of these businesses just by looking at their socials. And so that's how you create content that reflects your brand's values and mission. Like, that phrase values and mission sounds very like corporate-y, but ultimately what that means is what's the soul of your business, and how do you make sure that other people out there get to see it and experience it for what it is and what that means for you. So we take that to the point where embracing openness, it's how you grow. One of the things that, especially if you've been, I love watching like 80s movies and the very cold corporate things that happen in 80s movies is so incredibly different from how we have to present ourselves today. And in fact, this is a perfect time to bring up a very high level of the plot from Weird Al Yankovic's 1989 film UHF, where Weird Al's character has a ragtag group of TV personalities that are just trying to get this little UHF TV station, just trying to keep it running, right? And they're doing everything they can with their unique personalities and their unique perspectives. But what are they going up against? They're going up against the big major TV network in town. And so this is very much a David Goliath, like little guy versus big guy kind of story, right? At the end of the day, not to spoil it for you, because you really should watch this movie. But at the end of the day, the little guy wins. And the little guy wins by embracing openness and using that to grow. It's finding visibility in ways that the big guy can't see, in ways that larger corporations don't necessarily think of, and probably in ways that big businesses just straight up can't do. So part of that comes with leveraging social media and podcasts for brand visibility. And to put a pin and tie a little bow on my UHF Weird Al conversation, all they did there was, if you translate that to like what social media means, is they're like, well, this is where our voice makes sense, and we're just going to lean really hard into that. And one of the things that I can't tell you is which social networks make sense for your business. That's something that is unique to you and that you'll have to do a little bit of digging into where your audience is, what they're really taking in order to figure out what makes sense for you. So like B, did you have anything about, finding the right social network for your brand?
Yeah, definitely. If you're someone who's running a business and kind of doing, everything yourself, if you don't um, quite have the funds to hire like a social media manager, if you're wanting to do everything yourself, um, something I would suggest is to do some testing, find, like Lauren said, find where your audience is. If people are reaching out to you, via Google Business, then that's one thing. But if they're looking for you on Facebook or Instagram, let's say you're a baker and you want to showcase, all the great cakes and cookies and pastries that you're making, I would say Instagram might be a nice place for you to sort of build a portfolio and, show people what you can do. um, but yeah, I would say doing testing and, just making yourself available, I would say on platforms so that people have the ability to reach out to you, and being consistent on those platforms, as busy as it gets being a small business owner, making time to be active on socials and be consistent with it, I think will be very beneficial to your business, and let customers know that you're ready and available and you've got the answers that they're having questions to. But yeah, that's what I would say, to do some testing and find out what makes sense for your specific niche or business.
Yeah, absolutely. And the I one of the words that you said is just ringing in my brain. It's consistency, right? It's making sure that when you start something, don't if it doesn't work in like 2 weeks, don't drop it just yet, right? A lot of this is really cultivating that and seeing what works for you over time. And to your point there, like having had my podcast for as long as I have, I started with what at the time was like the big 3 social networks for getting creative projects seen. I was on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with it. And Twitter is where it really blew up for me. That's where I made a lot of the connections, and I think part of it was because my brand voice works best with short form social content, right? So like now I'm still using X for it, and I have Threads, which is kind of doing the same thing, but that's where I get more engagement than anywhere else for what it is that I do. I'm have historically had a very hard time keeping it consistent on Instagram because a podcast is inherently not a visual medium. So what am I even posting there other than, so it's been a balance. And again, I've had to learn as I've been going too. It's where what works for you is going to be the case by case basis. And that's legwork that you'll have to do, just as understanding where your business is, where those conversations are. And I talked a little bit earlier about how being in this space and fostering my brand voice helped me meet my husband. It was very funny. We liked each other's brands before we liked each other as people. But it's a good thing our brands were authentic because we ended up liking who we were anyway. But another little anecdote from my podcast journey is how sharing this fostered unexpected partnerships with a very, very loyal listener of my show, a young man by the name of Noah, who all he did was every time I would post on Twitter about a new episode of my podcast, he would reply with 2, 3, 4 tweet threads with his thoughts on the episode. And now I'm a busy person, I have my podcast. I'm an adjunct instructor, and I have my copywriting work here at web.com. I was like, dude, why are you're giving me a lot to read here, But then I read through it and I was like, this cannot be ignored. So then I started making sure that I gave him the thoughtful responses that his interaction warranted, right? And I would say a good year, year and a half went by of him just every episode, we'd just have a good little back and forth about it until I finally said, Noah, do you want to be on the show? And he said, yes, absolutely. And so since then, he's been on a handful of times. And those are the episodes where he's not the one giving me the engagement online with it because it was his episode, right? But I get other people reaching out to me saying, man, that Noah had some good points. And I'm like, I know. And they're some of my most listened to episodes simply because the conversations are so astute. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't fostering this relationship online. So like that's something that does, you may be thinking to yourself, well, does this have a direct correlation to what my business is? And like, yes, it can. Just making sure that you are fostering that online engagement can turn an average commenter into a brand ambassador for you, whatever it is you happen to be doing, right? The more cheerleaders you have out there, the better. And it all boils down to being relatable. Being relatable is good business. I would much rather do business with somebody that I feel like cares about having me as a customer and like I'm making a difference to them versus the other way around. And it's the kind of thing that you can absolutely do by making sure that your voice is unique and your voice resonates. And again, I can't tell you necessarily about how to be or who to be or what to be. That's all you. All I can say is that being relatable and making sure that your customers understand who you are and what you're all about can really, like the screen says here, turn connections into long-term loyalty. And I love the idea of opening the door to opportunities in networking and content sharing. It comes into basically saying like we're all in this together, insofar as there are so many small businesses trying to do the same thing that you're out there trying to do, that I'm out there trying to do, that it can be really hard to get your voice heard through the sea of all of these other things. And it's the consistency thing, B, that you brought up before, is like you stay ahead by staying connected with what your audience wants and like what they feel at any given time. So I am going to wrap this up by essentially saying that if you take nothing else from this, it's my assertion that the best way for a small business to cut through a lot of the noise that's happening online is to be authentic, be open to talking to your customers, and be relatable by speaking the language that they're speaking in the places where they're speaking it. And you will absolutely be surprised by what comes out of that. So, without any further ado, we are going to open this up to some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. Yes, like we said, we'll be saving some time here to do a little Q&A. So if you've got any questions that Lauren or I can answer, feel free to leave that in the Q&A section. Let's see. Okay, so we've got a question here. How do you know if you're ready to build your online community?
Oh, I love this question. And one of the best way for me to put this is to put it in terms of, if there's that thing, if you were invited to a cocktail party, if there was that thing that you could not stop talking about to the point where somebody else at the party was like, oh, you want to avoid the shrimp cocktail because that guy's over there yammering on and on and on about this thing, that's how you know it's time to start rallying a community around that thing. For instance, you know, with my podcast, which again, like podcasting is a little bit of a time intensive thing, but it is rewarding in its way with cultivating that audience relationship. But with my podcast, when I started it, people were like, how can you have a podcast devoted to Weird Al? Like, how much can there possibly be to talk about that? Well, I'm here to tell you that I've been doing it for almost 5 full years now, and I am nowhere near finished having things to talk about. So, if there's that thing, if the thing that you do is something that you can't keep quiet about, that's the time to start cultivating an online community around it. Whether that means, creating a dedicated Facebook group to whatever that passion project is, whether that's starting a podcast, or whether that's, having something that starts online and turns into like a more physical community engagement kind of thing, whatever that means, as long as you know you can't get sick of talking or thinking about or doing that thing, that's the time for the community.
Definitely. Yeah, great answer. I think having a lot of knowledge, not only knowledge, but, like you said, opinions and loving something so much that you can't stop talking about it. Yeah, I think that's when you know that you're ready. Let's see. Our next question is, how should I balance being professional while still being relatable and authentic?
Ooh. So I have to again kind of roll this back to some personal anecdotes. If you had um shaken 12-year-old Lauren awake and said, you're gonna be have a podcast about Weird Al and people are going to like let you talk about that in a professional setting, I would have said no, right? That's crazy. And also to that point, every once in a while something happens to me in my professional life where I'm like, really? Wow. I'm allowed to just be myself and good things will happen. So balancing being professional and being authentic, I almost feel like that's that's not even it's a valid question. It absolutely is a valid question, but it's almost something that shouldn't have to be asked, right? It's as if there's a line of thinking that says that there's something inherently unprofessional about being authentic. And I don't think that's true. I'm here. I am literally sitting in front of a wall of all my Weird Al memorabilia, and I am presenting a webinar for the company that I work at. And this is professional Lauren, but this is also authentic Lauren. So to answer that question, if you feel like you can't be professional while being authentic, then you need to find a different niche.
Well said. Well said. Let's see. We've got a message from Pierre here. How much time is devoted to beer on your podcast, or is it more about Al?
That's a really good question, Pierre. Thank you very much. And the answer to that is it has evolved over time as I've understood what resonates with my audience and what they expect from it. The show started out as closer to 50-50, where we would take a craft beer and pair it with a Weird Al song, much like one might pair a fine wine with a meal. Um, but that the beer part has pared down quite significantly because I found that my show resonated far more with the a Weird Al focused audience than a craft beer focused audience. The craft beer was just kind of a bonus. That was a hook. That was my, that was the thing, one of the things that set the show apart. So now if you listen to the most recent episode of my podcast, which funnily enough has Noah on it, I think I just very offhandedly mentioned the beer that I'm enjoying while we're having the conversation, and I don't talk about it at all. So it's now very much where it was closer to 50-50 when the show started. Now it's like 97-3. Thank you for that.
All right. Our next question from Susan. What is the best way to get your idea across to people?
Oh, that's a big question that could go many different ways. And almost feel like my answer is going to be a bit of a cop out. The best way to get your idea across to people is to talk about that idea where your audience is, right? So part of this is going to rely on some legwork from you. Meaning, if I'm a plumber and I am trying to drum up plumbing business, right? Will it necessarily make sense for me to devote um all of my efforts in community building to Instagram reels? Probably not, you know? But uh if I'm a cook, if I'm a chef and I have a restaurant where I specialize in gourmet hot dogs, would it make sense for me to devote most of my marketing energy on Instagram reels? Probably. Like if you're putting fun things together that people want to see, yes. So the best way to get your idea across to people, in my opinion, you got to start with some trial and error. Be very much like what you said during the presentation. It is going to be try something, be consistent with it for as long as you can to collect some kind of data, and if that doesn't work, go on to the next thing. I mean, I tried 3 different social networks at once until and then I found the one that really stuck. So I'm sorry if that's not as like a specific here's the actual answer for you, but a lot of what we do in marketing for small businesses is trial and error. We have best practices and we kind of have what we think will work, but we never know until we happen because humans are funny.
Definitely. Yeah. No, I think that was a good answer. It's a bit of a broad question. So I think, if you have some specifics. Okay, let's see. We've got a question from James. What works better, email marketing or social media?
Oh, so I wouldn't say that one works better than the other. I would say they have different purposes. Social media works great for acquisition and kind of maintaining keeping lines of conversation open with your customers, right? Email marketing, in my experience, is great for retention. Like it's email marketing. Like, yes, you have to like actively create the emails and send them out, but it's a lot more passive conversation with your audience, right? It's just kind of showing up in their inbox and hoping they open it, which is that can work. There's value in that. But in creating conversations and having your brand voice be heard, you can't deny the power of social media because um, one of the things that in my teaching, one of the things I tell my students is they have to remember the media part of social media. And one of the things I remind business clients is they have to remember the social part of social media. So if you're remembering to keep the social in your social media, you can't knock the value of that. But don't sleep on email marketing because that has benefits too.
Definitely. All right, let's see. Next question. Should my brand voice differ depending on the platform I'm using, whether that's LinkedIn versus Instagram?
Short answer, yes. It shouldn't vary too much, right? Because you're still one person. But speaking from my podcast does have a presence on LinkedIn. My podcast does have a presence on Instagram and Facebook and X and all that stuff. But I do slightly tweak the voice for the audience. I'm not gonna make a really really goofy joke on Instagram coming from my podcast on LinkedIn rather coming from my podcast, but I will on Instagram or Twitter, right? So it's a balancing act and it was like I said earlier, it's knowing the room, right? If you think of the different social networks as different types of parties, that's kind of how I like to pair it out in my brain. And I wouldn't show up to a LinkedIn party in shorts and flip flops. but I would show up to an Instagram party in shorts and flip-flops, right? I would dress up a little bit more for a LinkedIn party. So if you think about that, and just how to make your voice stay authentic, keep you know, I'll wear this flowered shirt on any social network I'd like. But you know, right. Keep you, but just remember that the tone of the room is going to be different depending on what social network you're using at the time.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Let's see. All right, our question from David. Roughly how much time should be spent marketing your brand starting from scratch?
Great question, David. Um, this is tough. This is a tough one to answer, because I don't want to tell a small business owner, you know, that half of your job with your small business should be promoting your business, right? It's really going to be how much time can you devote to stay as consistent as you need to be. So let's say you work, you know, a full 8 hours in a day doing what you do for your small business. Um, do you have the time to take an hour in the evening to devote to maybe compiling social media posts for the week so that you can schedule them to go up on whatever schedule works for you, right? Um, do you have the time between seeing clients to check your socials during the day and make sure you're responding things that need to be responded to? Um, so, you know, would it be ideal for every single small business out there to have a dedicated social media manager just being like, all right, I'm going to take care of all of this for you so you don't have to worry about it? Like, yes, but is that feasible for everybody? Absolutely not. So, the answer for most small businesses is do as much as you reasonably can that you can commit to staying consistent with. And if that means you can devote um, an hour a day, great. If that means you can devote an hour a week, well, you know what? Make the most of that hour. You know, do what you can, pack that hour with as much as you can. Um, the more, the better, but don't let it be all consuming. Because again, if you're authentic, it's going to resonate. It's a quality versus quantity thing in my mind.
Definitely. Um, all right. I think that is all the questions that we had. Um, thank you everyone who joined. And then just once again, if you missed it, no worries. We will be uploading this onto YouTube in the coming days. But thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you so much.